The Prime Minister's bombshell allegations lead to a war of words. I'm Mercedes Stevenson. The West Block starts now.
Explosive, certainly extremely alarming information around foreign interference.
What's behind Justin Trudeau's security claims about Conservative members? Plus, while the Bloc Québécois threatens to bring down the government, we'll ask Gilles Duceppe about what he sees for the future, an election and Justin Trudeau. It's been yet another wild week on Parliament Hill, with the Prime Minister claiming in his testimony that he says he knows of Conservative members of Parliament who are under threat of foreign interference. Here's what Justin Trudeau said on Wednesday.
I have the names of a number of parliamentarians, former parliamentarians and/or candidates in the Conservative Party of Canada who are engaged or at high risk of, or for whom there is clear intelligence around foreign interference.
But that quickly became partisan, with Trudeau criticizing Pierre Poilievre's refusal to get the top secret security clearance that would allow him to learn the names of those Conservative MPs.
And it is so egregious to me that the leader of the official opposition, who is certainly trying very hard to become Prime Minister, is choosing to play partisan games with foreign interference.
The opposition leader quickly released a statement calling the Prime Minister a liar. All this as more Liberal cabinet ministers pull their names out of the running for the next election. To help break all this down, we're joined by the Globe and Mail's Stephanie Levitz. On the security side, we are joined by Dan Stanton, former CSIS intelligence officer. You know, this has been quite a week, Steph. Let's start with you, and I want to talk to you a little bit about what's happening with Justin Trudeau's leadership, and then bring Dan in on the security side. You know, Eddie Goldenberg, former senior advisor to Jean Chrétien, writing a letter saying, for the good of Canada, Justin Trudeau needs to step down. Pretty strong words. This growing caucus revolt, questions about whether or not he's going to be confronted on Tuesday. Is the tone changing, and is he closer to being pushed out?
I guess the question has to be, will he allow himself to be pushed out? Because we have to remember a couple of things. That the caucus members that are upset with him, and I would suggest that, you know, there's an idea that there's this letter going around, everyone's going to sign it. Everyone's probably not going to sign it, but it is certain, I think, that the sentiment in caucus is that something needs to change, and that something is him. But they have no mechanism to push him out. They have only the power of persuasion. And at this moment in time, one wonders, can he counter that? Can he neutralize it? Can he dangle a cabinet position? As you've mentioned, we now have these open cabinet spots that could be a factor. Can he punt this down the line? Ultimately, at the end of the day, whether Mr. Trudeau chooses to stay or go, I know it sort of sounds simplistic. It is up to Mr. Trudeau, because at this moment in time, what we don't have, and I'll say at this moment in time, what we don't have are, for example, cabinet ministers putting their name to, no, he's got to go. We have only a handful of members of Parliament willing to be named as saying he has to go. So right now this pressure exists in the back room. Will it abate? I doubt it. But can he hold it off long enough to insert multiple options here? Perhaps.
Is there a clear contender if he does step aside?
I think that's one of the reasons you're not seeing a lot of people putting their names to this idea that he has to go, because there is no one person they are coalescing around. This is not a replay of the Chrétien-Martin War, where it was a very clear two camps or bust situation. There are numerous people who've mused about wanting to run for leadership. None of them thus far have publicly come out and said the Prime Minister has to go. They're all in cabinet. That could be a reason. But without caucus really uniting around another person, like if I could draw a parallel, if you'll permit me just quickly, between when Andrew Scheer was kicked out or was forced to leave as Conservative leader versus when Aaron O'Toole was forced to leave as Conservative leader. And they were two very different scenarios in which Andrew Scheer actually had a lot of caucus members on side. There was no suggestion that this is going to be the next leader. We want him out in favor of this person. So that unspooled quite differently than Aaron O'Toole. which was, it was pretty clear at the moment in time in which he was finally told to go, Pierre Poilievre was going to be the guy, and a lot of people were in support of that. That instance moved fast. It was swift. The leadership race was called immediately. Pierre Poilievre announced immediately. It was very clean. I think what's happening with Mr. Trudeau is more like what has happened to Andrew Scheer. There is no clear contender. And absent that, people aren't necessarily willing to take the leap.
One of the things that we saw Justin Trudeau do last week, which a lot of folks interpreted as part of him being under pressure, was his testimony at the foreign interference inquiry. We've been waiting for this for a couple of years now to finally hear him testify under oath. And he shocked a lot of people, Dan. You were there, you were in the room when, instead of starting out with what they knew, when they knew it, what they'd done about it, he pointed at the Conservatives and said, in fact, I have intelligence that they are compromised and they're the ones who need to worry, and Pierre Poilievre won't get his security screening so that he can have top secret classified briefings. What did you make of that?
Well, I was there, and it was entertaining. I was representing the Pillar Society. The Prime Minister was doing a good job, lots of stick handling, and then, yeah, he turned the tables on the Conservatives. A lot of people expected the Commission was just going to be focused on China and the Liberal Party, but there are surprises, and non-surprisingly, India did come up. But it certainly was a partisan moment, and it certainly shone the light on the opposition. And of course, then the whole issue of briefing, being read in, having a clearance came up.
So let me ask you that question. Does Pierre Poilievre need to get a clearance to be able to be briefed that way? He says his chief of staff has one. Is that sufficient? And is it true that if he had that information, he couldn't talk about it?
No. The leader of the opposition needs to get the clearance, needs to be briefed. And the chief of staff can't tell anybody that. He's probably going to be walking around Ottawa with these secrets, but he can't reveal it. So it's up to the leader to have been read into this so that they can then make decisions what to do with perhaps some members of the party that might at some time be in a position of power. He needs to get that clearance and he needs to read it.
So, Steph, what's his political calculation here on why he doesn't want to get it? Because it's feeding a lot of online conspiracy theories.
It absolutely is. But also, we could make the point, who is the most senior person in this country? The Prime Minister. Who has the power to declassify whatever information he would like to declassify whenever he would like to declassify it? The Prime Minister. If the Prime Minister was really truly worried about national security in this instance, if it was an issue that rose to the level that it needed to be shared, the Prime Minister could walk out of his home at Rideau Gate, go down the street in Rockcliffe, ring the doorbell at Stornoway, where Pierre Poilievre lives, and just tell him. And because of that, we end up in this awful situation where partisan politics, partisan hay on both sides, is being made out of a national security issue, not to mention the fact that it's unfairly tarnishing MPs. There is now this inference here that there are MPs that are traitors to this country. And let's be honest, we're not looking at every single MP thinking they're a traitor. We're looking at MPs of particular ethnic backgrounds, of particular cultural communities, because so much of this conversation is about specific countries. It's dangerous. It's dangerous to the national fabric. And Pierre Poilievre's not helping it. I'm not trying to excuse the way he's approaching it. But it is factually true that the Prime Minister could just tell him.
Well, and it's, some would say indicative of the sophomoric national security culture that we have in this country. Then in the U.S., they have very serious bipartisan committees that take on national security issues, and they don't just use them to advance their partisan interests. And watching this play out, Dan, I feel like looking at this, and I'd like your take on it, but I feel like I don't have answers now about how serious this is, or who's involved, or how many people, or to what degree. What effect does that have on our adversaries, too, being able to exploit that pulling apart of society? We need accountability. We need to know what's going on, but we now also have this vacuum of inference on both sides.
Well, that's exactly what's happened. I mean, the inquiry by definition was in some ways inherently political. I mean, there was pressure to call it, belief of Chinese interference disadvantaging the opposition. But what we're seeing now is it is somewhat a politicized process that's emerged, where partisanship is kind of leading things. I think what we're going to find at the end of the day is that these MPs may very well not have been, as Stephanie says, traitors. Some may have exercised poor judgment, some may have had a witting, semi-witting relationship with something, but in terms of national security, it may not be the end of the world, and it may not be any different than a party leader basically vetting their own staff.
Can they just release the names publicly?
No, it can't. You've got sources, you've got methodologies. It's going to put I guess you could say, shake up sources in other operations, thinking that someday their information is going to be disclosed. So it should be radio silence on those names.
There was, of course, this explosive story that came out on Thanksgiving Monday, almost a week ago, that the RCMP say they have criminal evidence, not just intelligence, but evidence that people linked to the Indian government, including their most senior diplomat who was here in Canada, were involved in a scheme of surveilling Canadian citizens, passing that information to others, and then hiring criminal gangs to carry out violent acts, including drive-by shootings, assassinations, home invasions. Really shocking stuff that we were hearing. Steph, a lot of people were suspicious about the timing of this. Now, I've talked to some senior national security sources who insist that this was underway long before that, but how does it play out for the Trudeau government? Did it help to give credibility for something that they had been so heavily criticized for talking about in public a year ago when they first said, look, a Canadian citizen has been assassinated by an Indian government agent or by the hire of an Indian government agent?
I think it's really unfortunate, Mercedes, that we have found ourselves at a point in our national security discourse where it is almost impossible not to see partisan self-interest on the part of the government whenever they do anything at all. Because I am not disputing the facts that the RCMP had. I am not, this is serious stuff. We can see, of course, as well, that the United States has subsequently followed with arrest and action of their own. So they're, a cross-border work on this. It's not existing in a vacuum. It's just exceptionally difficult to parse the two, right? To say that, oh no, this had to happen exactly when it happened, and oh, if there's a political benefit to the Prime Minister, great. I don't see it that way, and I think that that's part of governance, frankly. Part of governance, and people in Stephen Harper's government would say this too, any partisan government would say, you look at things through two lenses. You just always do. What is the partisan downside or upside to making this decision when I make it? Does it smack of this idea? I think the risk here that we get into is it looks like political direction for the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. That's dangerous stuff. Because if there's that inference, if there's that idea that the commissioner is not independent and is sitting there waiting to announce something when it's politically advantageous for the boss, I don't think we want to live in an environment where the politicians are telling the cops what to do.
And I think that's the challenge of the credibility here. I mean, the RCMP were on a flight before I think Justin Trudeau even knew about this brewing uprising. So the timing was separate from that. But Dan, how serious is this national security threat? I mean, I can't remember hearing about something this sophisticated that allegedly goes as high up in the Indian government as our national security sources.
Mercedes, this is unquestionably the most egregious assault on our sovereignty, on public safety that I've ever seen, heard, or read. You cannot make this stuff up. The Indian government was using their embassy and consulates as a command and control center to manage and plan serious crimes, homicides, violence, arson, extortion, a list of activities to create the illusion that Canada is being overrun by criminal gangs and terrorists of a South Asian background. This is terrible. This is awful, and Canada has to push back.
Lots more to talk about on this, I'm sure. Stunning stories ahead. The questions about Justin Trudeau's leadership. Thank you both so much for joining us. We'll see you again soon.
Thank you.